to be here. A little bit about my background. I came to higher education from a public school setting. There it goes. From there, I had a great opportunity to understand that learning, at least in the context of public schools, affords you the opportunity to see what students learn while they're in your classroom. When I was interviewing to return to higher ed as a hall director, I remember the interview committee asked me, why would you be interested in returning as a hall director? And I said, I think the number one reason is that working in residence life or student affairs allows you the opportunity to see where students come from and go to in addition to the formal learning environment. And you don't have that same opportunity in public education, at least I didn't as a high school teacher. I moved on from student affairs and started work with school reform. CMU is the largest university authorizer of public education, and so we were involved in creating student learning outcomes and curricular programs for students throughout Michigan, including 36,000 K through 12 students. Great challenge, but great opportunity. I had an opportunity to return to student affairs as an assistant director for residence life in 2005 to work with first-year programs, to serve as a director of the learning community. And since that time, I've been able to teach within the College of Education, specifically with human development and the focus on student affairs, and also work as a consultant for enrollment services and assessment and retention initiatives. So that's a little bit about my background. I tend to be heavily geared towards assessment. So that's just a disclaimer to begin with. And my hope is that by the end of today, we'll be able to assess our own readiness to think about a data-driven, learning-focused culture that deals primarily with the notion of learning as central, describe our own role in the assessment and how that plays out in our work, apply an approach. It's an approach that it's not nuclear science. It's pretty simple, the ABCD approach to creating student learning outcomes. I'd like to actually work to create a student learning outcome with you that you can use by the end of the session. And I'd like to differentiate the idea that an SLO is not meaningful unless it also has great application and ties into the institution. So I want us to be able to differentiate between an SLO and an SLO that actually has real meaning and has the ability to help transform what we do and the experience for students. And finally, I want to make sure that I leave you with resources so that you can continue to understand and explore notions of inquiry, assessment, and learning. So where does this all start? I have spoken with individuals a number of times, and depending on where you are within your own organization, you might think that the idea of student learning outcomes is something that comes from the vice president. Maybe it comes from higher up than that, from the president. I tend to think that it can come from either place. If you're working on a program in career services, for example, how does that tie into the overall goals and objectives of the organization? You can develop student learning outcomes for a program within your own residence hall. And I think one of the advantages is that having a bottom-up approach allows you to start to drive the notion that what you do is critically important and ties into the overall learning mission of the institution. So I just want to start wherever you sit in your organization. You don't have to have formal authority to start moving toward a learning-centered approach to the work that we do in student affairs, residence life, or housing. The reason that we really need to start focusing on this, it's not new. You probably have felt this at your own institution, but there's a real demand, public outcry in many ways about the accountability for what it means to pass through university, college, community college, and actually be able to do and know something different than you did prior to beginning. And we're really good at counting about how many degrees we confer, how many people graduated. The question that's really complex, it doesn't mean it's impossible, but that's complex, is what do students know and what are they able to do differently than before they joined us at our institution? And the same question needs to apply to our student learning outcomes for all the programs what is it that we expect students to be able to know and to do as a result of the efforts we put forward and the learning opportunities we provided, and then how do we know if that actually transpired? So accountability, our accrediting agencies are increasingly looking at not activity, but real learning. There's a political climate, I think many of us know that, whether it's in your state legislature or it's at the federal level, asking us to do more in terms of evidencing our outcomes. And the research base is suggesting, if you've read anything about academically adrift, that there's much more that we need to do. And quite frankly, it's just the right thing to do. If we're going to spend time and money and we aim to assist students in their development, we ought to know whether it works, and we need to be intentional about it. Just to get started, there are some significant research and reports that help drive what I'm going to talk about today. This is just a sampling. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. You'll have access to this and a number of resources that appear at the end of the presentation. But this is simply to say that this, what I'm going to offer today is situated in what I think is context of the research that exists and the theory about good practice, and also within the climate that we live in today in higher ed. So you think you want to do student learning outcomes. The first question is, well, what's in it for your organization? I would argue that as you think about creating an environment that focuses on learning rather than what you've always done because we've always done it, it allows you to have an outcomes-oriented and data-driven model that speaks to the larger university setting or community college setting. It reminds the community that learning is central to student affairs. We're not just generating programs to keep students busy or to keep them from drinking. Our efforts are to help students create new ways of knowing that they can apply in different settings in the future. It's about decision making, it's about emotional maturity, it's about developing mature relationships. You might apply Chickering's vectors to how you think about learning outcomes. You may begin with the approach of a Bloom's taxonomy in terms of how you're scaffolding and scaling things forward. Whatever your model is, it is increasing opportunities for you to show your colleagues in the academic division and your external constituents that student affairs and housing plays a critical role in the educational mission of the institution. It certainly will make it easier for you to expand, defend, or grow programs because you'll have a data backing that speaks to the questions about why should we invest, or why should we continue, or why should we change. The other aspect of the use of student learning outcomes that I want you to consider is that it helps the institution overall fulfill its mission. Student affairs, housing, and residence life are essential functions. They're essential functions that you can guide, you can flavor, you can improve, you can expand, but how you translate that for others to understand has a lot to do with the data that you're pulling together. And increasingly, folks aren't interested in knowing how many folks utilized a service or attended a program. They're not interested in counts. They're interested in the outcomes and the hard data behind it. So it also, I think, prepares you, once you have that data, to really communicate that your team is based on a group of competent professionals who really understand the student learning process. So just to create a baseline as we go forward, we're going to look at how research and theory underscores this. We're going to consider how your department or your unit or your office or your program's climate plays into the use of student learning outcomes. We're going to talk a little bit about the notion of having the right skill sets to be able to utilize student learning outcomes at your institution or with your program. And then how does it fit within the overall institution's climate. So the first activity I'd like you to kind of indulge me with is I'm going to ask you a series of 12 questions, and if you have something handy, a pen and a paper, and I'll give you a couple seconds to pull that together, I'd like you to answer by selecting all of the statements that describe your college, university, or department. And so pick one. Maybe it's your department that you're going to think about as you answer these questions, or maybe it's going to be your division. Perhaps it's your university. Choose one, and I'd like you to work through these 12 questions and kind of self-score. So for the first one, does your institution or department or program have a mission statement that clearly outlines core values? Number 2, is it learning-centered, and are you already outcomes-oriented? That you're really looking at data and the results from that to drive your planning. You follow a planning and evaluation procedure that are clearly understood by all the folks in your community. Number 4, do you continually collect data about your program's effectiveness, and do you use that to either eliminate or strengthen? And number 5, do you encourage members of the community in all areas to demonstrate a link between policies and programs and the activities that you're engaged in and your overall institutional mission and value? So a check mark means that that is true for you. If you don't check it, that's fine. So we'll move on to the last set. Number 6, does your institution or program encourage members of the community to demonstrate clear relationship to applicable theory, whether that's about ethical development, moral development, self-authorship? Those of us who have a background in student development, we could name probably 70 or 80 student development theories here. Is there a connection to applicable theory? Is there a documented use of hard data about the policies and practice and how that links to institutional need? And that's number 7. Number 8, is there an ability to demonstrate that hard data connects with student learning and success? So your program and your policies have been studied, and they clearly link to student learning outcomes or success. And success is a broad concept, I know, however you define that. Number 9, you conducted or your institution or unit plans to conduct an audit of your support services in preparation for some work related to student learning outcomes and improving a culture of evidence. Number 10, assist or you plan to assist folks in your area to identify gaps in their skills or knowledge to be able to work within a culture that's based on data-driven decision-making. And number 11, you're arranging the correct technical supports to help foster a culture of data-driven decision-making. And that may be folks who have an understanding of research strategies, assessment techniques. It may also involve folks who are able to do programming to export data from your student information system. And finally, number 12, verify that the folks that are in your area understand the importance of and the critical nature of having a commitment to partnerships to be able to have a culture that focuses on student learning. So if you think about those 12, and if you would, no one else will see these as we populate it, but I'm curious to know as we move forward, it'll drive some of what we do today. If you could give me a notion of how you scored. So if you could tell me how many check marks did you have? And in the question box, if you could just give me a 1 or 2 digit number. Did you check 1? Did you check 12? How many did you check? And if you could go ahead and just submit those now. And there's a great question from Matthew. Matt, when I'm talking about hard data, I am generally speaking about quantitative and qualitative. I absolutely value both in the assessment of our learning outcomes. So both have a place. Great question. Okay, we have, looks like most folks have responded at this point. I want to talk with you just, again, this isn't extremely scientific, but one way to think about this in terms of your scores as you submitted them, you have a climate, whether you are involved with or thinking about student learning outcomes as a focus. If you're between 10 and 12 check marks, you probably are living in and working in a climate that's ready and supportive of student learning outcomes in general. 6 to 9, you're on your way. There are just some gaps that likely need to be closed to move forward. And before you begin working with student learning outcomes, if you're in the kind of 0 to 5 area, there's probably some work to be done to just understand what's meant by a culture based on data and evidence before trying to implement an overall strategy that looks at student learning as the central focus for your operation. That doesn't mean it won't happen. It just means there's probably more time needing to be spent in cultivating the environment before taking steps. So if you're going to work to fill the gaps or kind of prepare the environment, think about how you might involve faculty and staff, whether they're current or retired. My experience has been in working with programs, there are a lot of retired faculty who would love to be involved in programs and continue on a part-time basis. They can really help you think about and work through without having to generate a lot of additional revenue streams or sources to support the activity. These folks are interested in being involved in, and they're an exceptional group of folks to be involved with as you think about moving forward. Consider the idea of scheduling some professional development activities for your entire division or unit around student learning. And then finally, perhaps you need to invest in having some experts who can come back and share information. I'd also suggest that following this, perhaps you think about a study group that focuses on knowledge gaps and ideas related to what's currently taking place and how student learning outcomes can be offered. I would also caution you to think about whether or not a student learning outcome is necessary. It's not necessarily required for every program or initiative that you're involved with in terms of your housing and residence life or student affairs functions. However, I would certainly and strongly argue that we are in a role as models, mentors, advisors, and teachers. Our words and actions absolutely play out in what students experience and what they learn. So having an intentionality about that is, from my perspective, critically important in the work that we're doing to link student affairs and housing to the overall institution mission. So as we get into learning outcomes, and we're going to start to get into the meat of constructing learning outcomes and how this is centered, I want to just make sure that we're situated in that learning outcomes is a part of a culture of evidence. So the value of student affairs has to do with the outcomes that we're able to communicate. It has to do with the research. It's connected to the research base that guides or should be guiding how we look at student development. It certainly has to do with other options about the focus in our particular programs or units. And it has to do with our program evaluation, which is very different than a learning outcome. All of this together starts to get at an iterative nature of how we look at assessment. Specifically, we want to be able to demonstrate that what we do is effective. It links to mission and goals, and I would caution you to remember something I said earlier, that it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. What we do in terms of designing student learning outcomes or how we approach it is going to look different at every institution. So we're going to look at this in terms of action research. So those of you who are researchers will understand this is not about peer-reviewed journals. It's not significantly quantitative at all times. It's not purely qualitative at all times. But we're looking at research that allows us to take action and that is a very legitimate form of research. If you start small and you're able to use the skills that exist and the time and the resources that are available, you would be able to begin, as a result of today, to develop and think about not only your student learning outcomes, but how you're going to assess those and how those are going to connect to your overall unit, division, and institutional priorities. One caution, while I hope that you'll use results as you move forward from your student learning outcomes to inform decisions, I would caution you to think I'd ask you to be very cautious about using any one assessment to derive success or failure about a program, or whether or not you're going to connect that to personnel evaluations. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So just to start, I would say you want to start, first of all, with what you're already doing. If you don't have any student learning outcomes in place, what are the programs or initiatives that are most important for your organization? And ask yourself, why are we doing this, and what is it that we were expecting students to be able to know or do differently as a result? Once you're able to identify that, you have at least a starting point. We don't want to start collecting more data. That is absolutely not the point of student learning outcomes. It isn't about having more data, it's about having the right data and using it and communicating about it and not putting it in a folder to collect dust or putting it into a digital file that no one's ever going to look at. In terms of context, NASPA, in terms of where this fits in 2009, and I apologize, this is the most recent data that I have, looked at institutions across the country and found that 80% of colleges and 14% of community colleges are involved in the use of student learning outcomes. So either in academic affairs or student affairs, just under 30% are involved in piloting student learning outcomes, and about 11% aren't sure or don't know anything about that. So it's increasing. I imagine if we were to conduct the same questions today, we'd find that many more institutions are involved in the approach of student learning outcomes. Again, 29% were testing, 18% were fully implemented at that time. In terms of looking at how they were assessing learning within student affairs and housing, many folks were saying that with their learning outcomes, they were using surveys and focus groups and self-evaluation. And Matthew, that gets back to your question about, is this purely quantitative? And you can see in terms of the assessment tools being used with student learning outcomes that it is a mixture. Most used were surveys, focus groups, least used, portfolios. I'm going to give you an example actually today of a portfolio with a rubric in terms of how you might consider some things that aren't heavily used, but certainly have the potential to be going forward within the notion of student learning. Additionally, there seems to be a need for access to coaching assistance for many institutions as they're working through the system, and additional time to really think about the intentionality of how you're going to implement student learning. And again, I'll go back to the assessment of culture. There is a great need to really understand what you're getting into before you start this. And if this presentation so far seems like it's very broad, it is intentionally. I want to give you some context. I want to talk about the culture of getting involved into a more data-driven culture within student affairs. That isn't how many departments and programs that I've worked with are often situated, and that is one of the most difficult changes up front. I want to talk about student learning outcomes next, and then I want to get into some ideas about assessing the student learning outcomes. So I am giving you a kind of a 36,000-foot view of student learning outcomes. I know that. I'd be happy to follow up with very specific examples of department plans or unit plans that get into kind of the granular level of doing this. So as you gather data in terms of what we found with NASPA, you're able to start then looking at and redirecting and eliminating programs. I had a consultant tell me yesterday that one of the things that may be essential in this work is to have folks from the very beginning create a list of things that we ought to stop doing. once you've identified those areas, then you can go back and look at what you are doing and how it fits. That's one approach. Another is to start with a blank sheet of paper and ask yourself, as a result of living in our residence halls or participating in our program, what is it that we really want students to be able to know or do? And at the 36,000 foot level, that could be at the department or the vice president's direct report level. It may be within your staff if you're a hall director and you're working with resident assistants or multicultural advisors or peer mentors. As a result of every program, what is it that you were hoping students would be able to know and do differently? Does that link to the overall priorities of your program or your programming model? So the essential question here is, have students learned what they're supposed to learn? So now we're going to get into really drafting a student learning outcome. I want to start first with this ABC approach. The idea of constructing a statement about student learning, this is not new. Folks who've gone through formal training and education, this is something you're taught. I'm not sure how often folks really focus on it. But the idea is that we're identifying first and foremost the audience. Do we have the right audience? What is the behavior or learning that's expected? What are the conditions, either the event, the intervention, the activity that's going to lead to learning? And then finally, the degree of proficiency, how well the person is going to be able to demonstrate this. And in terms of proficiency, we're talking about both immediate and, even more importantly, the ability to translate that learning into a new setting. So knowing it today, as 5 minutes after whatever activity occurred, isn't the same as knowing it in a new setting and be able to recall or make a decision based on something that was learned a year ago. We want to find opportunities to have deep, meaningful learning for students that will be applied into the future. So here's an example. Students who complete the financial aid seminar will be able to accurately complete the FAFSA application. So this is not uncommon. How about club presidents? So your hall council, a student organization president who completes the Leadership Institute, this might be a one-day program, a weekend program, will be able to correctly develop an annual budget and effectively lead a club meeting. Okay. Another example could be students who complete the graduation workshop will be able to successfully apply to graduate, run a degree audit, and list the coursework needed to complete his or her degree. So some of these are short-term, some of these are longer-term. We'll give you another example here. Here's an example. Students who complete a career workshop will be able to identify at least 3 pathways for their intended major. And another example using the same workshop. First-year students who complete a career workshop will contact at least one professional to investigate the option further within 10 days. And the option here is an option of one of the pathways. So they identified 3 as a result. Long-term, we want to know that they've done something. They've taken some action. They've explored further within 10 days of the workshop. So how might you assess these? You may do a pre-post survey. You may follow up with students in terms of a sample focus group or telephone interview that's conducted. A student in your office could do that. There are a number of ways that you could assess these. What I'd like to do next is I'd like you to think about your own area in which you work, and I'll go back to the example of the ABC approach. I'd like you to draft and submit in the question box just a short example of an SLO, something you think you might be able to use. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask if you're willing to share those. I'd like to pull a couple up and then have some discussion in terms of question and answer about what makes that a deep and meaningful student learning outcome, and then some ideas about how you might go about assessing it. And then we'll move into some assessment and evaluation examples next. So again, what I'm asking you to do is to think about something that you're currently working on or something you're thinking about doing in the coming year within your own institution, and identify one activity within that area and draft a student learning outcome using the ABCD approach. So I'm just going to go back so that we have the approach in front of us in terms of some examples. And so here's the approach again. So let's just take about 5 minutes, and I'm asking you to, again, to draft an SLO for a program that you're working with so that we can share those and kind of critique them together.
Jason, this would probably be a good time for me to just make a quick announcement. As y'all are working, if anybody has questions that you would like to ask, be sure to type them in the question box and I'll be sure they get routed over to Jason. Or we can try something if you'd like to ask a question verbally and you've dialed in on the phone and you'd like to press the raise your hand button, we can possibly call on you to ask your question out loud.
Can you confirm, I just sent an example from one of the number of examples that came in. I've sent one example out for folks to look at. Eric, can you just confirm that that would have been received or went out correctly? Or maybe somebody can just give me an okay they saw it.
Jason, we appear to maybe be having some audio problems. Can you repeat what you just said again, please?
So my question was, I just submitted an example of a student learning outcome that came in from the group, and I wanted to make sure that went out correctly.
It looks like it did go out to everybody.
All right, thanks, David. What I'm wondering, as you look at that specifically, what thoughts you have about this particular student learning outcome and how it may follow the ABC approach. And then second, what if you were looking at this and providing feedback to your colleagues, what questions would you have about one, learning, and then two, how you would understand the outcome and whether or not it took place? What thoughts do you have regarding that particular student learning outcome?
Jason, I'm sorry to interrupt. It sounds like we're having some technical difficulties with the audio. I'm having difficulty hearing you, and I think a couple other audience members are as well. It sounds kind of garbled on the microphone. So if you can make any adjustment at your end that's possible, or if we still have trouble, we may ask you to just go ahead and dial in on the phone. You want to try it one last time?
Sure. I'll try again. Is this any better?
It's a little better, but we're still getting some kind of weird background noise when you speak.
I'm not hearing anything on my end, so I'm not sure what that is. I will go ahead and dial in.
Okay, sounds good. Everyone will just pause for just a second. Jason's going to go ahead and dial in. So Jason, if you want to click the telephone button, it'll give you the phone number and then an access code. So we'll pause here until you get back. Okay, Jason, can you hear us?
I sure can. How's this? Is this better?
Yep, much better.
Okay. So again, my question was whether or not folks saw the example that I sent out. Should have gone out through the all response to the question and answers. Did that go through correctly? And I saw a David confirmed a Roger, so thank you for that. The question about the student learning outcome example that I want you to consider is this concrete enough to know the audience and to be able to think about how you might assess it? In terms of this example, is it students who participate or students that complete? And I know that may sound like semantics, but if a student actually completes the program, will they be able to intervene, or will they know and be able to utilize in a new setting the identifying markers to assist students who might have signs of suicide ideation or mental health concern? So I guess I'd ask you to make some very clear distinctions about what it is you're looking to measure and what you're expecting staff to be able to do. I gathered from reading it that we're asking that staff who go through training and complete training, that in a new setting will be able to recognize markers of distress and effectively intervene to refer students within a very short period of time, whatever that is for your division or your department, to the appropriate resource. And how would you measure that? Well, you may look at the number of instances of students who are in distress versus the number of students identified before there's some type of disruption to the living and learning community. That's something you could track in terms of numbers. I'm not exactly sure, given this student learning outcome, how I'm going to measure the effect of their work on another person. I can, however, pre and post assess whether they had knowledge of the behavioral markers that may suggest distress, and whether or not they knew appropriate ways pre-post to intervene. So just a couple of thoughts about how you might reconsider that student learning outcome. And again, in this case, how you're going to measure it plays out. If you're not sure that you're going to be able to assess it, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it or you shouldn't care about it, but it becomes increasingly difficult. So as you think about creating at your institution student learning outcomes, sharing them with colleagues, taking just 5 minutes at a meeting where you're sharing a student learning outcome with one another and requesting feedback about how this is going to be measured, how does it align. You know, there are institutions that have great examples of how this all fits together. Again, there's no one way to do it. What's important is that you're focusing on what's a priority, a strategic priority for your institution. Again, I wanted to make sure that we really talk about this in terms of the bigger picture, gathering data and interpreting that to make decisions. So if in the example of having RAs and MAs in your system who understand and can acknowledge warning signs outside of training and be able to do something is important, how do you break that down into some areas that you can gather data about and then interpret whether or not the initiatives that you're engaged in are playing out the way you expected them to in the behavior of your staff, that students go on and they're not doing this just in terms of their job, but they're doing it with friends and others. Some key questions, again, to ask: what are you trying to do? Why is it important? The best example I can give you about this first question and how important it is, colleagues working in financial aid talked to me about their student learning outcome a few weeks ago, and one of the comments was, well, we've developed a student learning outcome about our FAFSA program. We want, and their learning outcome was something to the effect of, students who participate in our financial aid workshop will be able to complete the FAFSA. And I said, okay, do you walk through and actually have them do the FAFSA as a part of the workshop? Well, no, we tell them about it. I said, okay, what do you tell them? Well, we tell them that, you know, this is where they go online and here are the pieces of information that they would need. And I said, okay. And so the learning outcome is fine. My question was, if the goal is that the folks would actually be able to know how and complete the FAFSA, maybe it isn't the learning outcome that's the issue. Maybe it's the program. What if all individuals who attend the workshop come prepared with the items that they need, and at the end of the workshop, they will have completed and submitted their FAFSA? Oh, you know, the reaction was, well, we hadn't really thought about that. So again, what are you trying to do and why? And as you start to look at that student learning outcome, I think it will allow you to ask good questions about what you're doing and is it the right initiative. The assessment strategies or practices as you go forward can be very traditional, and these are kind of teacher-constructed tests, they're recall, they're indirect evidence, or authentic. Can someone perform a task? So the example of being able to submit a FAFSA, they're real life. They're able to structure something in a new way, and or it involves direct evidence. As a high school teacher, folks who are used to taking multiple choice tests, for every exam, they had to recreate a lab in the science courses that I taught. They thought that was evil and mean, but doing a lab as a part of homework or in class, if they really understood it, had mastered how to understand and do that lab, they ought to be able to do it 4 or 5 weeks later. So the idea here is that learning that takes place today translates into the ability to apply and do something farther down the road. Again, some of these are very traditional, some of them are authentic. The idea is that there is no one best approach. These are just simply some common formats. The most common in student affairs and in residence life happen to be rating scales, Likert scales, or descriptive ratings. I also think that you can find great value in thinking about rubrics in terms of evaluating what students are producing. If your hall council or a student group that you're working with are creating something, what should they be able to create as a result of the year? Is it that every student in your learning community will have an accurate 4-year plan for how they're going to move through? And when I say accurate, I mean if you don't have an automated degree mapping system, that they're able to interpret the bulletin and apply it and then show that they're making progress towards their academic planning. An example, in our first-year learning seminars, we have a series of objectives. The learning outcomes you'll see are stated on the left-hand side here, and we have examples when they include their portfolio at the end of 8 weeks, whether it exceeds, meets, or is below the expectations for learning. And this is reviewed. It's a random sample out of the 1,600 students that are enrolled. We have faculty who reviewed this. Each of the portfolios, a random sample of about 100 to 200 of these a year. And we're looking at whether or not across the courses there is a meeting or exceeding. And if it isn't, we know that there is a learning outcome that is not being presented well. It's not being explained well on our part. It's not being delivered in the way it was intended. We may need to just rethink whether this is the place for it in the course. But this gives us, again, a random view of students, about 1,600 students a year. So the culture of evidence tends to look like the idea of an annual assessment. It may be a calendar. Some institutions or divisions, every so many years you'll have a cycle of how you're doing surveys. These may be benchmarks. It may be that you're looking at benchmarking data about satisfaction. It may be that you're doing benchmarking data about engagement. It also is not just about the national evaluations that they're doing. It likely has to do with your program, services, and activities. So specifically, that program you're offering to engage students as new leaders on campus. What did they know before? What did they know? And what could they do differently as a result of that program? Budgeting and the planning and the use of this in terms of your overall operational structure has to be there. Trying to do student learning outcomes on top of 18 other things tends not to work very well. And if there's no support in terms of ongoing discussions and it's not going to be used routinely, we know what happens. If it's not used routinely, it tends to kind of fall by the wayside. And again, the last part of a culture of evidence, it tends to have a need analysis. There's a reason we need to do this. There's urgency. There's a point of view that it is critical to the overall function. And it tends to be based on the notion that having data and a research base is a quality structure. It contributes to a quality structure. And time has to be set aside. I can't emphasize this enough. Adding this on top of 18 other things isn't going to allow you much success. If it's done well and intentionally, it will not take an inordinate amount of time. But if you're looking at 18 or 15 or 25 student learning outcomes and how you're going to collect that data, and you're doing 18 or 25 assessments to figure out each one of those learning outcomes, you're going to be absolutely inundated with work that is unnecessary. If you are intentional, you may have 1 or 2 assessments that are going to give you the data you need to understand your student learning outcome. Finally, you've collected all this information, you're able to understand the impact that you're having, you need to share it. And a culture of evidence is about opening up and being transparent, sharing what you're doing, asking for feedback, and continually improving the student learning outcomes and then your assessment practices. Some examples, DePaul, Old Dominion, Central Florida. I'll just kind of buzz through some of these. But you can find a number of institutions who are doing great work with student learning outcomes, whether it's at the college and university or the community college or junior college level. Electronically, there are some great URLs in terms of looking at resources. There's a great occasional paper. It's occasional paper number 7 from the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. It came out in December 2010, so it's been out a little while, but it's by John Chu and Ann Gansmer-Toff, and it's the role of student affairs in student learning assessment and student learning outcomes. So there are some great online resources and centers. Jonathan Mueller is a faculty member. He has a great website that gives examples, definitions and examples of authentic and traditional assessments to use with this. Penn State Pulse, Syracuse University both have great resources. The National Learning Outcome Assessment Organization, that is the organization that produced the occasional paper I was just talking about. That is an exceptional resource as you think about it. I'll go back. Also the Association for Institutional Research. That's headed by Randy Swing. Randy was previously with the National Policy Center for the First Year of College, which is now the Gardner Institute for Undergraduate Excellence. Both of those organizations, AIR and the Gardner Institute, are also great resources in terms of thinking about learning outcomes. And then finally, NASPA. Obviously, it allows you to focus primarily in the Student Affairs Division, and they have a number of presentations and resources available. If you're looking for print, just a few more slides here that allow you to look at some additional resources about student learning. A couple takeaway points. We want to make sure that student learning initiatives are intentionally designed. Learning does not happen randomly or unintentionally. I mean, it certainly does, but we're not able to then understand whether we had an influence on it. So when we are in charge of thinking about what's best for students, we need to be intentional, and we need to look at designing and assessing in a meaningful way. We have to remember that we're teachers and facilitators of the learning experience, and what we say and do matters in terms of our modeling. And we need to think about our evaluation in terms of evaluating what we expect to occur first and then transfer second, how that plays out in new settings. And the last takeaway point is that outcome-based assessment is action research. Folks think that, well, if we do this, this isn't really, this isn't serious research. It is. It's serious to the point that it matters directly to the students we work with. So with that, we have just a few minutes left. I wanted to leave some time for some general questions. So Eric, I'll turn this back over to you.
Okay, great. At this time, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them on the question box. One of the questions that came in from Chris, will you be sending out the PowerPoint slides? Chris will be actually posting the entire recording of today's webinar along with a separate file of the PowerPoint slides on the GLCUHO website, glucuho.org, under the resources heading. There's a webinar archives that will appear there. So the resources will be available usually within about 48 hours after the webinar is concluded, but I'll do my best to get them up before the weekend. Other questions, please feel free to submit now, or if you'd like to raise your hand and be called on verbally, we can do that as well. Not seeing any more questions yet, Jason. We'll give people another couple minutes, but
Sure.
Great presentation.
Eric,
Yeah.
Eric, I'll just say as well, the again, this was a 36,000-foot view of all the possible things related to student learning outcomes and the assessment of those. Anyone who's interested in very concrete examples, I have examples that involve department plans, unit plans, and I'd be happy to share either the grids or some plan examples that show the learning outcomes and the associated assessment measures as well.
Very good. Thank you. Matt Darmschroeder just said thank you as well. So good feedback so far on today's presentation. This is the last call for questions before we end the webinar. Last call for questions. Okay, well, thank you again, Jason. Excellent presentation today. Just a short housekeeping item. If everyone wants to stay tuned to their state listserv for GLCUHO, we will be starting conference registration that will open up in July. so that's coming soon as well. We have some other great webinars that are already being scheduled for the upcoming weeks, so stay tuned to your email as well for those, the ones that are left. And also the Glucuho website, we'll be posting those on the main page. So if anybody has any last-minute questions, they can email Jason. His information was on the previous slide. Or you can email webmaster@glucuho.org, and I'll be happy to forward that on to him as well. Thanks, everybody, for attending today. And Jason, thanks again for presenting. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks. Have a great day.